Good evening, Liberty.meers, and thank you for joining me tonight. I missed last week. I'm so sorry, but my summer of freedom is finally at a close. Yeah, to a long round of traveling. Really, I went to Acton University, a massive undertaking with, I don't know, 1,500 people or something like that. Very, very interesting conference. Libertarian, liberty-minded, totally dedicated to teaching about freedom. And one second here. Actually, I want to make sure I just changed my microphone. Yeah, that's a better sound, I'm sure. So, but it's a conference dedicated to freedom, but with a different spin. It's trying to it attracts people who are interested in religious faith, Protestantism, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, and addresses the subject of freedom from that point of view. And I went immediately from there to Voice and Exit, this beautiful conference in Austin, which, you know, is like a completely different world, right? So it's not so much religion, it's all about futurism and personal growth, personal thriving, and that sort of thing, technology, a completely different ethos, but again, the same theme, human freedom, you know, every time. And then went from there to PorcFest, which, again, a different culture. Agorism, you know, plain people working out their lives, trying to find freedom in a practical sense, living in New Hampshire, which is one of the freest states in the United States, which maybe is not saying much, but it actually is. And, you know, in a private campground where there's you know, let's just say that civil liberties are at a premium, you know? So lots of fun, spontaneous order all around. Essentially, the camp organizers just, you know, they don't organize anything. They just let people do their thing. Just filled with seminars all day. This year, I had a heavy intellectual content, actually, which delighted me in. Because it was a little different from what you might have expected. But otherwise, again, a different culture. And from there, you know, to Freedom Fest, which, you know, Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. So lots of glitz, lots of glamour, you know, heavier emphasis on politics. I mean, in New Hampshire, you know, the idea of national politics just is not a question. I mean, we're not going to get Marco Rubio, you know, or Donald Trump at PorcFest. But sure enough, at Freedom Fest, you know, there they are, addressing the crowd, lots of Republican activists, but again, lots of libertarians, and the theme, again, human freedom. So here you have 4 separate events and 4 completely different cultures, you know, traditional religious faith, futurism, agorist, civil liberties activism, and politically centered, reformist, freedom-mindedness. 4 different parts of the country. Each of these conferences, every one of them, without exception, had attracted more people than ever before. Each of these venues was mightier than ever in the past, and that's a fascinating thing to me because it indicates, you know, it's not proof, but it strongly suggests not only great work on the part of the organizers of each one of these things, you know, and great use of social media and marketing, but also suggests to me that the liberty-minded social movement, for lack of a better term, is more robust, more energetic, more creative than ever before, and growing. It's growing outwards and it's growing deeper, so in all directions and in unpredictable ways. And it's a fascinating movement to me because it is so diverse and yet sort of tolerant in every direction. There's no intolerance really in any direction, all these things. You know, of course, there's always friction and difficulties, but I have some sense that the old factionalism of the past, when the liberty movement, the libertarians were smaller and they used to argue incessantly, you know, among themselves about small points of doctrine and that sort of thing, you know, mutual excommunications and recriminations, what Russell Kirk calls the chirping sectaries, you know. I have a sense that it will never go away. It is dissipated to a large extent, yeah, because we're starting to realize that there's many ways that freedom expresses itself in the world. There's not one way forward. There's not one theory that everybody has to adhere to. There's not one way to work out what freedom looks like in your life or looks like in the world. The whole point of liberty is not to codify and encase and to freeze the proper way to live. The point is to observe that all of humanity and all of us thrive better in a world without authoritarian rules and without the leadership principle being the guide. I don't know why we have to keep learning this lesson. The lesson is really the original liberal insight from 500 years ago, that, oh my goodness, the world woke up one day and said, we've made a mistake for, a few thousand years. We thought that the way to create a good society was to have a smart, holy, well-endowed, well-resourced, powerful person at the top, or a committee at the top, to come up with a good plan and impose it on the rest of the world. It turns out that's not the right way. The right way is exactly the reverse. That was just a big mistake. The right way is the reverse. It should be the case that the energy of the social order comes from below and doesn't need to be organized from the top. In fact, it doesn't need to be organized at all. If you let people pursue their individual dreams and their own interests, people will find a way to crawl their way towards ever greater prosperity and thriving, and getting out of the state of nature into civilization. And that's the only way it can work. It's a spontaneous process. And by the word spontaneous, I mean that it's the effects and the results cannot be imposed from above or cannot be anticipated in advance. That it's not a result of a rational construction. It's a result of rational individual behavior, people pursuing their self-interest. And it turns out that the social order contains within itself the capacity for making these individual pursuits of self-interest, turn into gradually evolving and ever more cascading expressions of mutual association and an ever greater bounty in the world. This is the great discovery of 500 years ago. It's the discovery of liberalism, and that gradually evolved over the course of hundreds of years to what we now call libertarianism, or, I'm happy to call it anarchism. I don't believe in a state. I think you all know that. But it's a beautiful insight, and it's one that every generation has to learn anew, because there's something, I think, in all of us that wants to believe in some way that the reason the world looks like it does, that the reason things succeed and the reason things fail is due to somebody being in charge of the system. This is true for institutions, organizations, and whole societies, whole economies, and for the whole world. There's something within us that is always looking for the rational understanding of why the social order exists. Why did the GDP grow? Why did these inventions come about? Why do we live longer? Why is it that we've been able to get rid of this disease and this infant mortality? And why is it that there's an ever larger middle class, all over the world? Why has poverty collapsed? Why is violence down? There's something within us, and I think it's a disease of intellectuals more than anybody else, that wants to find the single source, the reason, the person with the plan, who is in charge. We want to know this, and liberalism is a fascinating theory of life, that it says nobody is in charge, and that's precisely why we're seeing progress. It's counterintuitive. It's something that every generation has to learn anew. So tonight I'm just, and well, just to back up to the Summer of Freedom, what I'm calling the Summer of Freedom here. I see this happening, and it's an extraordinary thing, actually. When you think about it, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, even 5 years ago, you wouldn't have imagined anything remotely this robust and this massive, spreading around the country. This conscious adoption of a theory of liberty as being something that really matters, something that is a truth that people are discovering gradually. And what better time to discover it than the digital age, right? I mean, we're living amidst this spontaneous theory of life. We're seeing how it works in the app economy and the growing peer-to-peer economy, and what Hillary Clinton apparently called the gig economy, which is a nice phrase, actually, and she's dedicated to crushing it, by the way. But we're seeing in our time this sort of gradual devolution of the nation state, the globalization of the economy, the intensification of individual action as the core molecule of the social order, and ever more evidence that the theory of the 20th century that order can and should be imposed from the top in order to bring about more progress. That view of life has so many anomalies, crushing it and attacking it and bombarding it at every second, that we're really coming to this stage in history where it is increasingly unsustainable. I think we're seeing this in our politics every day. I mean, it's actually rather amusing to watch politics. And I go through phases, I don't know if you're like this, but I go through phases, like sometimes I just, not even slightly interested in politics, can't even stand to read the political section. I don't know the candidates, I don't watch the debates, and that's generally the way I've been for better part of 10 years. Now I find myself suddenly interested in it, and I am reading the political news, which is interesting. Not in order to cheer this candidate or that candidate. Of course, I have my favorites, relative, sort of, not really, but I'm interested to see the sort of unfolding of what I think is going to happen here. We've got a presidential election in which all of these would-be leaders, I mean, the people who are sort of running to be appointed as the central planners, as the great minds who will construct society, become the heads around which national life will resolve, according to the old theory of the presidency. We're seeing them run and pitch their plans and try to persuade us to vote for them and tell us about their vision of life. What should be legal? What should be illegal? What should be subsidized? What should be taxed? And it's interesting because if you think about it, our economic and social and cultural lives are proceeding through a series of changes at a pace that we've not seen in 100 years. I mean, we live in a different world today than we did 5 years ago. It's just a fact. Digital technology, mobile applications, the internet, the rise of the internet, the digitification of everything. I'm not saying that right. Digitization of everything is proceeding at a pace that's just breakneck and changing the way we interact with other people, the people we hire, where we live, how we find apartments, the goods we buy. Everything is having cascading effects on prices and availabilities of everything. I mean, nowadays, it's astonishing to think, like, what kind of consumer goods are available to us, what kind of jobs are open to us, very unlike the jobs we ever imagined before. So anyway, we're going through these rapid pace of change, and it's funny because presidential elections happen only once every 4 years, and so they're like brief slices of moment in time, where we get to hear, the nation's most, biggest blowhards and the sort of the most intellectually confused among the entire population, the most personally ambitious, in a political sense, the people who have a desire to rule each other, all argue with each other about what the plan should be. But meanwhile, the reality of life has ever more outpaced this periodic every 4 years sort of discussion we have. I mean, we live in a different world today than we lived in 4 years ago and 4 years before that. I mean, yeah, let's face it, the world of 2000, is unrecognizable to us. I mean, none of us would ever go back. We all live differently. We shop differently. We work differently. Our values have changed. Our perceptions of life and what it is and how we integrate our personalities into it. The value of education, the value of healthcare, where we're going to get our healthcare, how we should conceive of our retirement, how our children should be raised, where they should go to school, if they should go to school, and so on. All these values are in a dramatic upheaval. And it's pretty interesting to see, every 4 years, we dust off this new crop of these really, I mean, so sort of an alien species, suddenly coming in to talk to us about how we should live. But my own prediction is I don't think that they have anything to do with what our lives are like. And I think it's going to be a fascinating political season just to hear them talk. And I anticipate that at the end, there's going to be a growing cultural chasm between the political class on the one hand and the way they speak, the way they think about the country and about our lives, and the way we actually do live our lives. I mean, it's going to be divergent. And this is going to be ever more obvious. And I think this has powerful effects. People are going to be starting asking the question, why should these people rule us? Why do we need these people? They're not saying anything that seems to have anything to do with my life. I think this is going to be a very decisive year in that sense, or in the next 18 months, for that very reason. It's going to expose the essential incompatibility between our political system and our economic, social, and cultural lives. So that's why I'm fascinated by this, and every day it happens. I've had this is why I'm writing more political articles nowadays. When I was in Las Vegas, I heard Donald Trump speak, and one of the most not just one of the most, it was the most incredible political speech I've ever seen. I mean, my jaw was on the floor the entire time. I mean, this guy just lives in a different time, a different place, and probably inadvertently resurrected a theory of politics that was more worthy of sort of interwar or would-be dictators, than anything we know today. There's nothing in common. It was breathtaking. I think Nick Gillespie blogged during the speech or tweeted during the speech that this man has a tenuous connection to reality. No question about that. Very tenuous connection to reality. But I think probably you could say the same thing of the entire political class. Hillary Clinton, I was just reading about a speech she gave at the New School in New York. I guess it was on, I don't know if the speech is scheduled for tomorrow or if it happened last Monday, but it was just said Monday, and I couldn't find a copy of the speech, so I'm not sure if it's happened or if I was reading reports of what's about to happen. But blasting the peer-to-peer economy as sort of undermining American wages, So here you have this sort of syndicalist desire to kind of prop up labor unions, reinforce the uncompetitive system that peer-to-peer economics is breaking down. So what's she doing? She's going to throw her power and her rhetorical energy into crushing something that's actually on a very diffuse and diverse basis benefiting the whole population. So she wants to shut it down, global trade has been an immense benefit for all Americans. I mean, it's not even possible to conceive of the world without the global economy. There's nothing, very few items, if any, in your own room where you're sitting right now that didn't require some sort of international cooperation among market producers in many countries to make, including all parts of this computer and everything in front of you. And yet here you have Donald Trump, railing against globalism and calling for an 18th century style mercantilist policy, combined with a a 1930s style, protectionist, jingoistic nationalism. It's amazing. I mean, these people are so completely out of touch, and they have one ambition, which is to get elected, and what they do with their power after that is across the board completely dangerous. I mean, what exactly does the political class have to offer the population today? I mean, truly. In 1930, you could understand it. Maybe in 1940, you could understand it. In 1972, maybe you could sort of vaguely discern something like that. Or even in the 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, there's seems to be something for the politicians to do. Nowadays, reality is quickly outrunning any plausible account of how the political class can benefit us. So I think that this is actually why libertarianism, as we know it, is so much on the rise in all generations, all around the country, really all around the world. It's a global movement. It's very popular and very, very wonderful. I'm especially excited that thankfully, due to the internet and social media, the ongoing conversations, and places like liberty.me, which is really, in a way, for all the English-speaking world, the central hub in many ways of this movement, and not just in many ways. I think it is, and about broad libertarianism, central organizing hub and tool and publishing venue. We've been able to make so many diverse resources available that we're starting to understand that libertarianism isn't just one thing. There is no plumb line, actually. There's a series of theories, a series of insights, all centered around this one liberal insight of 500 years ago. We don't need an authority structure imposing from the outside some system that's alien to and exogenous to the rest of the social order and our own individual preferences and plans. That's the one insight, but beyond that, its application in any particular area is different based on individual values, different intellectual systems. And I think we're beginning to realize that now. And I think that's extremely important. There isn't one libertarianism. There's many ways that liberty can be expressed in this world and understood in this world. And discovering the right path for society and for ourselves to discover the newest technologies, to discover the best rules, the best norms, the best social conventions requires an ongoing process of experimentation. You shut that down, you freeze it in place, lock it down with the state, which is the institution that does that, right? I mean, when the state acts, it freezes. That's the essence of statism. It stops progress. That's what Hillary Clinton wants to do. That's what Donald Trump wants to do. It's what they all want to do. They would stop the motion, the daily, hourly, minute-by-minute iterations of ever more experiments and living better. That's what government's all about. This is essentially why I don't believe that we need a state at all, because every time it acts, it seems to do damage. It stops this process. And libertarianism has come to terms with this, I think, increasingly so, that we need experimentation in every area of life, not just in economics, but also in criminal justice, in regular kinds of adjudication of all disputes, and religion and family life. No one knows the answers. It's precisely because we don't know that final answer, that final way, that we need, desperately, desperately need a system of liberty, without which we shut down progress. So that's the way I understand the world, and that's why I understand why liberty is growing so much. I think the book that I'd like to talk about tonight, or at least center my discussion on tonight, by Wendy McElroy, makes a very powerful contribution to understanding the place of libertarianism in our lives. Now, just some background on Wendy. She'd been writing very actively in the liberty realm since about the late 1960s. A very early convert to sort of radical anarchist theory, and you can see that she went through many iterations as a thinker and a doer, and many understandings of how liberty can come to mean something in our lives. And this is the core subject. It's like, I mean, the question is, like, why should you develop an intellectual commitment to liberty? And what should you do with that commitment once you have it? These are very profound and important questions, and I think they deserve to be dealt with seriously and grappled with in a robust sort of way. Now, you remember that libertarianism as such was born in the latter stages of the Second World War. I mean, there were several books that came out that seemed to make the big difference. Hayek's Road to Serfdom, Mises's Omnipotent Government, Rose Wilder Lane's Discovery of Freedom, Isabel Patterson's God of the Machine, John T. Flynn's As We Go Marching. These were the main texts, but there was also The Fountainhead, a hugely important book by Ayn Rand celebrating modernity and creativity and personal integrity and the courage of the individual at the expense of rather than the collective. That's what the essence of The Fountainhead was. And as important as all these books were, and they all were very important, the establishment of the Foundation for Economic Education, I mean, you can't overemphasize just how important that was to American libertarian thought. There hadn't been a think tank up to then. It was established in 1947 and became a central organizing hub for decades, and continues, I think, today. And I work, as you know, for doing digital development for fee right now. It's one of the great honors of my life. But I think one of the books that was extremely important in making the real difference was Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I've talked about this many times in this podcast. I won't belabor the point, but what was the value that book added? What was the thing that made that book different from The Discovery of Freedom, from Omnipotent Government, from The Road to Serfdom? All these other books were about the kind of political system we should have. Rand's Atlas Shrugged addressed that question. She did. It was a very important part of the book, really, in many ways, the core of the narrative. But she added something different. What she did was she personalized the message, and she took the message of freedom and instilled it into the mind, heart, and soul of the reader with a message that said, you should do something about this. When faced with tyranny all around you, you need to act. You have it within yourself to defeat the tyranny that's trying to crush you. You have a moral responsibility to live well, and to not let anybody stand in your way. All the rest of the apparatus of what eventually became objectivism is not as important as that fundamental insight. You do not have to be part of the collective. You are an individual. The individual is the driving force of the social order. You possess that individualism within you, and you have within you the power to make a difference. So she constructed her entire narrative around this idea. Individuals dealing with the presence of tyranny. What do you do? Do you acquiesce? Do you become part of the system? Do you turn a blind eye? Do you just proceed with your work and don't pay any attention to it? Or do you find it within yourself to act courageously within your sphere, whatever that is, and to carve out a life of freedom for yourself? And if she said you should do that, that's what's required of you. That's what keeps civilization clicking forward. That's what prevents the world from falling apart. individuals that take it upon themselves to be free. And that's an awesome message. I don't need to get into debates about ethical egoism or selfishness, and I mean, there's a lot of silly moments in Atlas Shrugged that I'm I laugh reading as much as anybody, but you can't deny, or for that matter, even the atheism. I mean, I don't think that's essential to the value of the book, frankly. I mean, I love reading this stuff. It's interesting because Rand is just a study in herself. I mean, she's just a fascinating person to like watch her mind work. You sometimes don't know where she came from or why she existed. Can be very strange. None of that really matters. What matters is this fundamental insight. I think it transformed a generation. I mean, here's the thing. It took an intellectual position that was already pretty well developed. An intellectual position that grew out of Road to Serfdom, an independent government, God of the Machine, Discovery of Freedom, Foundation for Economic Education, the works of Mises, Human Action. That took all this apparatus that was already out there and sort of, it was just an intellectual position of what the state should and shouldn't do, and took that huge apparatus and remolded it, and recodified it, and represented it, recooked it, remixed it, and turned it into a message that penetrated the heart and gave us a way of living, thinking, and acting that was personally transformative, and gave you a new value about your life and a new direction for how you should live. That's epic. I mean, I really have to ask the question, what would have happened to libertarian theory as it emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s without Rand's message? I don't know. And if you have doubt about this, you should have a look. You should read Murray Rothbard's letter to Ayn Rand after he read Atlas Shrugged. He said it changed his life. I mean, it took what was a theory and turned it into a life plan of action, like a dedicated moral commitment that made him think differently about himself and his place within the world, and what he should do about that. I just, without that additive, I'm not sure what would have happened to libertarianism. It would have always remained an abstraction, or just an unrealizable political plan. I'm always affected very profoundly by something that Mises said when he was on the boat coming over from Geneva to arrive into New York. He wrote his autobiography as if his life was over, and he said, I set out to be a reformer, but I ended up becoming a historian of decline. This is a danger for all of us. We set out to be reformers. We think we can change politics, but instead we end up just writing stories of decline, just becoming chroniclers of growing amounts of despotism. And Mises nearly despaired, I mean, he was strong stuff, so he was able to work through this, but most people just are not able to do that. Rand gives you something different. What she said was, you have an obligation and you have the opportunity to change. You can save yourself, if nothing else. You can save yourself, you can save those you love. And if we all do this, then we can change the world. But only flowing out of individual action. You have to change your life. You have to act on your own. Without that action, without that commitment, without that dedication, everything just remains an abstraction. So Wendy was born into this firmament. I mean, there's no question she was influenced mightily by Rand, as was everybody at that time. Everybody. It just changed everything for everybody. It gave them a life mission and caused them to dedicate themselves to doing anything possible to change the world. Well, the first thing that everybody resorts to in a democratic system like the United States is to throw themselves into elections and politics, That's always the first step, and I kind of consider it a youthful error. I mean, it's one thing to be involved in politics because you like it, you're delighted by it, you like canvassing, you like petitions, you like cheering on this guy and saying down with this guy. It's another thing to actually believe that politics is the source of change in the social order, like the prime mover, which is just wrong. It's just not. It's a lagging indicator. It's not the prime mover. It's not the best way to change the world. But a generation, I would say, in the early 1970s came to believe this. I mean, we had a series of things happen. The founding of the Libertarian Party. Excuse me. Founding of the Libertarian Party. The advent of a sort of increasingly codified systems that became siloed. Rothbardianism. You had Misesianism. Objectivism, growing iterations of these kinds of silos, all of which claim to have the final answer for what we should do. And the one method that anybody really thought of was political organizing. And what you find in this book, The Art of Being Free, is really a chronicle of Wendy's. It's not autobiographical. It's really intellectual. It's an intellectual book because it covers so much history and so many wonderful movements of liberation throughout history and so many beautiful biographies of great libertarian thinkers and activists and issues. But what you see is a sort of an unfolding of a realization that she has, and if you read nothing else in this book, you have to read the last chapter where she comes to terms with this. She realizes that the main way that she can make a difference in the world is through her own life and through her own actions. Like, the question is, even in the presence of a Leviathan state that you personally cannot change, what are you going to do? Are you just going to become a historian of decline? Are you going to wallow in despair? Are you going to sit around going to bed at night, every night, just hating the state? Or are you going to find a way to love liberty and implement it and be free, live free? That's the question. And I think Wendy's book is a very important statement about the need to be free regardless of things that are going on around you. So I think, in many ways, what she's doing here is recapturing those early moments in her own life that inspired her towards libertarianism. I think Murray, if he had lived long enough, would have written a very similar work and said, something like, the responsibility for freedom comes down to you and me alone. It's nobody's obligation to give it to us. The state certainly isn't going to grant it to us no matter how much we protest and beg and plead and vote. It's never going to happen. Freedom comes about through our own actions. The state will, if it does change, will eventually have to acquiesce to a new reality that it cannot manage anymore. When the state loses control of the system is when the political system will change. But by the time the political system changes, freedom, as libertarianism understands it, will have already changed the culture and the society. Freedom will already exist by the time the state has to acquiesce and defer and to its own obsolescence. You see? So that's the way the social order changes, as she describes it. But even if that's not the way the social order changes, you still have something to do in your own life. Libertarianism, in short, in Wendy's understanding, mature understanding, that libertarianism as a theory, or liberalism as a theory, or freedom as a value and a philosophy, is not primarily about politics. It's not exclusively about politics, no. And it's not even primarily about politics. The real message of freedom is ultimately a personal message, and it's about our lives. That's an awesome insight. It changes the way you think about the world. In what way does it change the way you think about the world? Well, liberty. Well, McElroy applies it in several areas. And there's no grand answer here. It's a series of small answers, right? So for her, it's about financial independence, and having control over your life. One of the insights she has in here is that she realized that the stuff around her that she owned and the sort of consumerist mentality of getting ever more things was actually oppressing her personally. It was getting her in hock to bankers, tied down to maintaining all the property, keeping it from being constantly devalued, keeping up with others. All this stuff was making her less free. So her path towards freedom is about getting rid of things, simplifying, reducing, scaling down, becoming mobile, getting out of debt, raising her own food, which is a very nice thing. The most I've ever done is grown tomatoes on a potted plant. So what do I know about raising food? But I can see how raising your own vegetables might, give you a sense of your own power as an individual to make a difference in your life. There is something charming about, even in my case, growing a tomato and eating it, it gives me a real thrill. I love that. It's just a symbol. It's not real freedom, but it's a symbol of freedom in some way. Other people, dealing with their children. It's about homeschooling. It's about carving out new ways for them to live, keeping them out of debt in college, finding alternative paths forward. It might be about migrating out of the country. It could be about new methods of child raising. After all, I think one of the great insights that Rand had, and I think Murray understood this too. The whole libertarian tradition has understood this, even if we sometimes forget it, that power isn't just about the state. It's about anybody in your realm that rules you through fear and threats. That could be a boss. It could be a pastor. It could be a spouse. Power comes from many places in society, and the power is the ultimate evil. The state is only the greatest expression of that evil, and the most institutionalized and the most dangerous expression of that evil. But there's ways we can deal with power in our own lives. There's ways that we can become freer. Sometimes it's small decisions. Paying off your bills. Getting out from underneath an overly consumerist, oppressive, materialist environment where you're sort of being ruled by what you own rather than the reverse. Or it could be big decisions like moving out of the country or quitting a job that's high paying and stable, but ultimately making you desperately unhappy. Sometimes it's just about exercising your rights. You have a right. You have rights. You have human rights, and you can exercise them. About going up to your boss and saying, you know what, this is not working for me anymore. Thanks, but I'm gone. That's an awesome feeling to suddenly take charge of your life, and that's ultimately what it's all about. It's about taking charge of your life and not letting third-party people you never invited in, or maybe you did, but you'd like to disinvite them now. Not letting others control you. It's about exercising your individual will and realizing that your mind, your will, and your volition is ultimately the source of your own happiness and the way that you will make a difference in this world. So to me, that is extremely interesting. And I think what's happened over the last several years in the evolution of libertarian thought is that there's been a growing rediscovery of this. We used to think that libertarianism was all about politics, all about having a platform, all about having a better plan than the other guys, or electing this person instead of this person, having a better budget, a better privatization model, the answers to all human problems, as imposed from the top, even if it means deregulating and privatization. We used to think that libertarianism was exclusively that and nothing else. It is that, and that is important. Freedom does have profound implications for public policy, but the question is that all it is, or does the idea of freedom reach to a fundamental truth about humanity, our place within the social structure, and does it ultimately have implications for the one area of life that we truly can control, which is what we as individuals do with our lives? That's massive. That's enormous. That's powerful. And what's interesting to me, and this is essentially what her final chapter is about. She thought in the old days that she had found a political idea. What she discovered over time is that ultimately the idea of freedom is a personal creed. There's no one model for how that works itself out, but the insight that life, a well-lived, successful life, extends from our individual decisions and our own actions and our own beliefs and our own values. That's the thing she had to rediscover. And it is a rediscovery for her, because as she reflects on her life, she realizes she somehow once knew this. She once knew this as a young woman when she first got inspired and got interested in the ideas of liberty. But then over time, she found herself being politicized, being overly consumed by fear of the state, by an obsession with the details of politics and policy. And she describes it as sort of eating away at her brain, and also demoralizing her spirit. Because, what you discover is exactly what Mises discovered in 1940. It's like, there's nothing any of us can do to cause the despots at the top to change what they're doing. Nothing any of us as individuals can do today to cause them to change their behavior. We can't burn the law books. We can't convert the president. We can't control the bureaucracies. Those things are just given. That's the world we inherited. The question is, what can you do that's within your power to make a difference in your life? And that's the critical issue. That's the way libertarianism can and does express itself in the world. The recapture of that insight, I think, is the great contribution, the great movement of our time. And let me just return to these 4 conferences I went to, because in all 4 cases, we see attempts to personalize and turn into actionable items the idea of liberty. I think this is immense. In the case of Acton University, people want to know, how can they bring their deep commitment to religious faith to making the world a better place through acknowledging the truth about human freedom? How do you avoid good intentions that go awry? How can you engage with members of your congregation in ways that make freedom more real and productive and meaningful in your life and other people's lives? How's your practice of private charity making a difference in a world where the government presumes a monopoly on charity? How can you break down the system? How can you better serve others? These are the kind of questions. How can you live out the gospel mandate? These are the kinds of, within the context of the realization of the truth of human freedom. This is the kinds of questions Acton University is asking. It's a very personal kind of approach. And of course, at PorcFest, it's the same thing, right? Everybody's trying to figure out a way to realize what freedom means for them as individuals. Whether they're trading cryptocurrencies or arming themselves, or just pursuing their unusual talent for yoga and teaching others about yoga or cooking or whatever. To see everybody striving and trying their best to be free. You get 1,500 people in one campground all doing this, and seeing the beautiful order that emerges. It's quite frankly, it's awesome and it's inspiring. I loved it. Just how tight and personal this message was. These are not people gathering to hear lectures about national political topics. These are people gathering to find out, to share ideas, to live better lives. That's huge. I mean, you understand this kind of stuff never went on 20 years ago. This is immense. And then going down to Voice and Exit, which was a fantastic. I'd never been a part of that. Of course, I'm not really part of the sort of the hipster, Austin, techno crowd. So, to encounter this, the ways technology is transforming our lives and our minds and the way we think in our relationships. That's what the whole conference is about. That itself was an awesome experience. Every single talk was about without exception, every talk was about our personal values and how we should respond to the world around us, whether it's thinking about immigration, or in my case, I talked about the origin and meaning of distributed networks and what that means for property ownership and communication in our time, and why that makes a big difference and how we should respond to that. But there's so many other talks about, about health, psychological health, physical health, dealing with doctors, medical tourism, you name it. Everything was about us as individuals. And then I'm leaving one out. Let's see. Freedom Fest. The same thing at Freedom Fest. It started as an investment conference. And now I think that there might have been 2,300 people there. It was awesome. It's still about investment. I mean, there's, probably 20, maybe 25% of the talks there were about personal investment strategies, but it's also about, personal wealth, protection, child rearing, asset management. I was on probably 8 panels. Every one of them was dealing with practical topics. Pretty awesome. Again, a different, much more well-heeled. The people at Freedom Fest are very different from the people at Pork Fest. There's some overlap, but it's a different spending habit, shall we say? I'm very optimistic about this. I mean, you see, what my point is that I think Wendy's book, which came out only 3 years ago, I was the publisher, by the way, the initial publisher, but I published it because I had discerned probably 3 or 4 years ago that something was changing in libertarianism, that something was that this old model, by old I mean 30 years old, not Randy and Leonard Reed old, but 1970s, 1980s old. That something was fundamentally changing. Something was taking the ideas of liberty and traveling with it out of a purely politicized message that was narrowly defined in terms of the individual's relationship to the state, and was reaching for a broader truth about human life. And Wendy's book encapsulates that, and very beautifully, very elegantly. It's the kind of book that, she just opened up her heart, That's why I published it. I encouraged her to write it for that reason, because I discerned this happening in her own life, and I wanted her to capture this. And it's happening now. And so you see why I'm so optimistic, right? I think that this is a necessary stage of change. Unless we can make liberty real, it just doesn't have a future. But when we do make liberty real and begin to kind of look at our own lives and figure out how it matters to us as individuals in terms of our daily choices, there's several things that happen. We become happier. We become more successful. We become smarter, more discerning. We recapture a sense of personal power, which is, essential to our humanity. But there's something else. When we all do this together and the idea spreads, and ever more people living free, you actually build a new kind of social order. You're actually building out the structures of a realized liberty, despite the tyrannies that happen in our time. And you begin to outpace the capacity of government to manage human life. That's a beautiful thing. I mean, how are we going to get freedom? unless we establish it ourselves. How are we going to drive the state out of our lives unless the state becomes demoralized at its capacity for expecting obedience? Once that expectation is gone, there's no amount of guns, tanks, power in the world that's going to stop that freedom from emerging. I mean, a social order that has moved on past the capacity of the ruling class to manage it will not be recaged, and we will find the ruling class made obsolete and unable to catch up. But you see that why it's important to take that initial step. I mean, freedom just doesn't come because certain books are written, or because people at the top are converted to a new system of thinking. That's not the way it works. It works because people have begun to live in a different way. I think that's our fundamental obligation as libertarians. And I'm excited about this. I'm excited about this change. I'm not sure I would even call it a change. I would call it a form of growth. We've grown as a movement in every way, not just in numbers and quality of thought, but in the application of the ideas of liberty in all of our individual lives. And I think that's the really critical difference. And it's hard to chronicle, it's hard to document, really, but I do see it happening, and I certainly saw it this summer. And in fact, this is the article I'm working on right now. To me, this book, Art of Being Free, is a very important sort of document, because I think in many ways it kicked off, or at least serves as a sort of symbol for a new era of libertarianism. I like to think that Liberty Me captures this really well. In fact, you look at it, the title Liberty Me, I mean, it came out of this perception that liberty has to be ours and ours alone. It's about me, it's about my liberties, That's why the domain was chosen. That's why I chose that domain, and that's why we built this website and why we offer you this service. So now I find that I'm out of time. I don't understand how it happens that I talk for a full hour here, and the time just goes like that. I feel like I just started talking and suddenly it's all gone. So it's nice to have you as an audience. I appreciate that, and I appreciate having you on here. I'm not sure. I haven't been checking the chat box to see if we have any questions or comments. We very well may. But I think I'll just leave it there for tonight. Thank you for being with me tonight, and thank you for being on our website, and for helping build the Freer Society. I think we're on the cutting edge, and I think you are the vanguard, right? Even if you're not out there protesting in the streets and pushing for this politician or that politician, or writing your congressman, you're engaged in a revolutionary act just by trying to be freer, in small ways. How's it going to turn out? I think it's ultimately unpredictable, and that's part of the beauty of the world. The less predictable the world is very likely the freer a place it is. So let's live, let's observe, let's learn, let's act, and make the world a better place together. Thank you so very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Good evening, Liberty.meers, and thank you for joining me tonight. I missed last week. I'm so sorry, but my summer of freedom is finally at a close. Did a long round of traveling. Really, I went to Acton University, a massive undertaking with 1,500 people or something like that. Very, very interesting conference. Libertarian, liberty-minded, totally dedicated to teaching about freedom. And 1 second here. Actually, I want to make sure. I just changed my microphone. Yeah, that's a better sound, I'm sure. So, but it's a conference dedicated to freedom, but with a different spin. It's trying to it attracts people who are interested in religious faith, Protestantism, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, and addresses the subject of freedom from that point of view. And I went immediately from there to Voice and Exit because it was a little different from what you might have expected. But otherwise, again, a different culture. And from there, to Freedom Fest, which, Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. So lots of glitz, lots of glamour, heavier emphasis on politics. I mean, in New Hampshire, the idea of national politics just is not a question. I mean, we're not going to get Marco Rubio, or Donald Trump at Pork Fest. But sure enough, at Freedom Fest, there they are. Addressing the crowd, lots of Republican activists, but again, lots of libertarians, and the theme, again, human freedom. So here you have 4 separate events and 4 completely different cultures, traditional religious faith, futurism, agorist civil liberties activism, and politically centered reformist freedom-mindedness. 4 different parts of the country. Each of these conferences, every one of them, without exception, had attracted more people than ever before. Each of these venues was mightier about small points of doctrine and that sort of thing, mutual excommunications and recriminations, what Russell Kirk calls the chirping sectaries. I have a sense that it will never go away. It is dissipated to a large extent, because we're starting to realize that there's many ways that freedom expresses itself in the world. There's not one way forward. There's not one theory that everybody has to adhere to. There's not one way to work out what freedom looks like in your life or looks like in the world. The whole point of liberty is not to codify and encase and to freeze the proper way to live. The point is to observe that all of humanity and all of us thrive better in a world without authoritarian rules and without the leadership principle being the guide. I don't know why we have to keep learning this beautiful conference in Austin, which, is like a completely different world, right? So it's not so much religion, it's all about futurism and personal growth, personal thriving, and that sort of thing, technology, a completely different ethos, but again, the same theme, human freedom, every time. And then went from there to Pork Fest, which, again, a different culture. Agorism, plain people working out their lives, trying to find freedom in a practical sense, living in New Hampshire, which is one of the freest states in the United States, which maybe is not saying much, but it actually is. And in a private campground where there's let's just say that civil liberties are at a premium. So lots of fun, spontaneous order all around. Essentially, the camp organizers just, they don't organize anything. They just let people do their thing. Just filled with seminars all day. This year, I had a heavy intellectual content, actually, which delighted me in than ever in the past. And that's a fascinating thing to me because it indicates, it's not proof, but it strongly suggests not only great work on the part of the organizers of each one of these things, and great use of social media and marketing, but also suggests to me that the liberty-minded social movement, for lack of a better term, is more robust, more energetic, more creative than ever before, and growing. It's growing outwards and it's growing deeper. So in all directions and in unpredictable ways. And it's a fascinating movement to me because it is so diverse and yet sort of tolerant in every direction. There's no intolerance really in any direction, all these things. Of course, there's always friction and difficulties, but I have some sense that the old factionalism of the past, when the liberty movement, the libertarians were smaller, and they used to argue incessantly, among themselves about